Now, for the moment, though, we have, without question, seen a shift in foreign policy, not just from this government, to be fair, but over the last 2 or 3 years as a result of increasing international tension. There's no question that the world has always been a dangerous place to be, and New Zealand is a mouse at the end of the day. We hover around at the feet of, well, elephants and lions and tigers and, frankly, feral coon cats. And New Zealand is just one of those little mice scuttling around down the South Pacific. I think always thinks itself is much more important than it really is, but it isn't. Nevertheless, we are a trading nation, and we need, because we are a trading nation, almost wholly reliant upon trade for our national GDP. We are utterly reliant upon having good relations with good people and bad people, with good players on the international scene and bad players on the international scene. And a classic example of that, of course, is that our major trading relationship at the moment is with China, who I think take almost a third of our exports. Actually, the United States now has got into second place, which is staggering to me, then the Australians on the latest stats that I've seen. But we need to enjoy good relationships, we think, with everybody that we trade with, God, even the Russians, because at the end of the day, they make our economy work. But there was a shift, if you like, and it was discernible actually long before this government, when Jacinda Ardern, and that's when she was the Prime Minister, I think 2022? Yeah, 2022 was she go. She headed off to NATO and one of their conferences, and was invited as a member to attend a NATO conference and to speak with some of the principals there. New Zealand also made very clear that it was going to support the NATO effort and the US effort to provide support to Ukraine after they were invaded, and has taken a much stronger view, it seems, in supporting over the last 2 or 3 years, and particularly over the last 12 months, the American worldview of the Pacific, of Southeast Asia, of Asia in general, and the belief that the Chinese can't be trusted. Helen Clark, former Prime Minister, Don Brash, have formed, if you like, an alliance of their own in response to that. And they have argued that New Zealand's independent foreign policy, and the key there is the word independent, is being compromised. In actual fact, the rhetoric that Don Brash used over the last couple of days is that Christopher Luxon has in actual fact sold us down the river, which is pretty extreme, certainly from Don Brash. He joins us now to talk on these issues. Welcome to the show, Don. Lovely to have you on.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to be on it.
I hope I've characterised what's happened, because I've seen what you've written, and that's why we're going to be talking about this over the next wee while. But this shift in, if you like, foreign policy, I noticed, and I didn't see anybody getting too upset about it then, when Jacinda Ardern was reacting and, as I said, attended NATO and conferences like that. It was pretty obvious then that she was aligning New Zealand much more with an American or global view then, wasn't it?
Yes, that's quite right. I think you gave a very good summary, actually. This process began when she was Prime Minister. I think Chris Hipkins, when he was briefly Prime Minister, also went to a NATO meeting. The current Prime Minister, Luxon, has taken it further and made it quite unambiguous that we are in America's camp. And we think that's a serious mistake.
Aye. Is the obvious question to ask you?
Why? Well, because what we're seeing is not, as it's sometimes portrayed, a fight between democracy and autocracy, US being the democracy and China being the autocracy. What we're seeing is a very traditional fight between an established power and a rising power. In the article which you mentioned, I quote a book by a guy called Graham Allison, who's an American Harvard University history professor, written a book called Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? And Thucydides was a Greek historian who wrote the story about the rise of Athens, which challenged Sparta. They both went to war, and both were substantially destroyed. And Graham Allison looked back over the last 500 years and says, look, there are 16 cases where an established power was challenged by a rising power, and not in every case, but in 12 cases out of 16, war was the result. And what Graham Allison argues, basically, is the US has been the unchallenged world power, certainly since the collapse of the Soviet Union, until a few years ago when China has emerged from centuries of being insignificant internationally into being a significant power. And the US is saying we don't like that challenge, and to the best of our ability, we're going to keep China hemmed in to its near coast. And I don't think New Zealand's got any interest at all in picking either side in that dispute.
Okay, we are, though, part of the Western values and civilization, Don. As you say, the United States has been almost our guarantor if there was aggression from non-Western states since certainly the Second World War, or gosh, even during the Second World War, which is one of the reasons why traditionally the party that you used to lead was always such a keen supporter of ANZUS. Isn't it just that the National Party is sort of re-establishing or reaffirming philosophies it's always held?
I think that's right. I think it is quite right. Having said that, you again characterize this as a fight between Western values and the other. We associate Western values as being democracy. The US is more than happy to enlist non-democracies on their side. The US clearly, for example, supports Egypt, supports Saudi Arabia, close relationship with Saudi Arabia. They've been actively canvassing support from Vietnam, a clearly communist country, which of course was involved in a war with the United States not so many decades ago. But now, because they are anti-China, or perceived to be anti-China, they are, quote, one of our allies, unquote. So this is not, as I say, a fight between Western values and the rest. It's a fight between an established power, the United States, being challenged by a rising power. We had Hugh White in New Zealand a couple of weeks back. He was on the platform, I think, with Sean Plunket. He is a professor of strategic studies in Canberra at the Australian National University. He's written defence white papers for the Australian government. He worked closely with Bob Hawke when he was Prime Minister. And he has said what we're seeing now is the greatest shift in relative power that we've seen since European settlement in New Zealand and Australia. A huge increase in the power of China. Chinese economy now is significantly larger than the US economy, measured at purchasing power parity exchange rates. And given the fact that China's population is some 4 times that of the United States, that difference in scale is going to almost certainly continue to grow. And the US is saying we don't like that. So we want to keep troops in Korea, Japan, Guam, Papua New Guinea, Philippines, Australia, etc., to keep China hemmed in. And
can I go back on that, though? There's no question, as you know, that the Chinese have finally unleashed the potential that was there and are unleashing it still. They may well become the most powerful nation economically and militarily in the 21st century. But isn't it also true, Don, that their values and principles, the way in which their worldview, if you like, is antithetical to much of Western culture and civilization?
Yes, that's true. That's right. That's true. But, I think what Hugh White was arguing is we're moving from a unipolar world where power is heavily concentrated in one power to a multipolar world where there are going to be several major powers. US, China, he thinks India, Russia, he thinks you can't ignore because they've got 5,000 or 6,000 nukes or whatever the number is. You can't ignore Russia as a power center. And Europe, he sees the 5 major powers in the world over the next half century.